Hi there, this is Andy from Blessed Man Meditations. Recently, Alex O'Connor from Cosmic Skeptic posted a video containing about 40 arguments for atheism. I have no personal vindictive vendetta against Alex or against any other atheist. I love Alex, and I love all atheists as my fellow people, all created in God's image. But I believe their epistemology is wrong and needs to be responded to. This video will be part of a lengthy series I plan to do in response to each argument Alex makes. So please like this video, comment, and please subscribe. I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.
A new, fast-growing Christian YouTube channel, Redeemed Zoomer, put out a video promisingly called All Atheist Arguments Answered in 10 Minutes. Let's see how he does by science and use this as evidence for God's existence. Still, I think we're in agreement here that scientific explanations and divine agency can coexist peacefully.
If God is good, why can't he destroy all evil? Well, he eventually will. Why can't he do it now? Because he'd have to destroy you.
Okay, I totally get the Christian idea that human beings are corrupted and evil. Of course, all of us constantly fall short, even of our own moral standards. Fine, so destroying evil requires destroying us. But you've just said that God will one day destroy all evil. He just can't do it now, because that would mean destroying humans. But what will change so that one day he can destroy evil without destroying humans? And why can't that happen now? As far as I was aware, the thing that allows human beings to escape being justly destroyed for their sin is the sacrifice of Jesus, which happened a good couple of thousand years ago now. So what is God waiting for to destroy evil? Perhaps you're talking about the second coming of Christ, Judgment Day, but then what changes about the world between now and then that God is suddenly able to destroy evil without destroying humans?
Why?
This is the second response to Alex's excerpt from the Redeemed Zoomer video about the problem of evil. And to recap, the Redeemed Zoomer video contains the dialogue between the Christian and the atheist. And in the Redeemed Zoomer video, the atheist says, if God's good, why can't he destroy evil? The Christian in the Redeemed Zoomer video says, God will eventually destroy evil. The atheist in the Redeemed Zoomer video says, why can't God destroy evil now? The Christian says in the Redeemed Zoomer video, because he would have to destroy you, me. And in Alex's video, Alex says he totally understands the Christian idea that humans are corrupted and evil. Alex agrees that all of us fall short even of our own moral standards. Alex says the Christian says that God will one day destroy all evil, but he just can't do it now because then he would have to destroy humans. Alex asks what would change so that God can one day destroy evil without just destroying them. And then why can't that happen now? Alex's understanding is that the thing that allows human beings to escape being justly destroyed for their sins is Jesus' sacrifice. So what is God waiting for to destroy evil? Alex says perhaps the Christian is referring to Christ's second coming and Judgment Day. But Alex asks what changes in the world between now and then that God suddenly is able to destroy evil without destroying humans. So here's my response to Alex. In that video, here's my response taken from a different website, gotquestions.org. So, the question is, what is Theodicy? The answer is, Theodicy is a branch of philosophy dealing with the issue of evil in light of God's existence. And it seeks to answer the question, if God is just and holy and good, then how do evil and misery exist? That's the question that Theodicy wrestles with. History's most famous statement of the problem of evil comes from the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus. The question is God willing to prevent evil but not able? If so, then he's not omnipotent. Is God able but not willing to prevent evil? Then he is malevolent. Is God both able and willing to prevent evil? If so, then where does evil come from? Is God neither able nor willing to prevent evil? Then why do we call him God? Of course, most people have no experience with philosophers. They do, however, watch movies, and a slightly modified version of this idea came from the character of Lex Luthor in an action film. In Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice, a quote is made. It says, if God is all-powerful, he cannot be all good. If he's all good, then he cannot be all-powerful. The biggest hurdle in discussing theodicy is a tendency to waffle on the definition of certain words, or to color certain words with a meaning that's not part of the argument. So, in order to really understand the concept of theodicy, one has to carefully define his terms and then stick to those definitions. First, we'll look at what evil is not. The primary issue with the problem of evil is defining what evil actually is. Evil is typically seen as a force opposed to good, forming a yin and yang, or two poles of a magnet. Defining evil in this way leads to a logical problem for the theist. Why would God create evil? God created gravity, light, magnetism, and so forth. Why would he also create evil? The most logical answer is simply that God didn't create evil, because evil in and of itself does not actually exist except as the absence of goodness. Similarly, God created light, but did he also create darkness? No, because darkness in and of itself does not exist. Darkness is only a term we use to refer to a relative lack of light. It's entirely defined in terms of deprivation, the absence of something else. The same is true of physical heat. Heat is a term used to describe the motion of atoms and molecules. When an object is cold, it simply has less molecular movement, relatively speaking. At absolute zero, all molecular movement would completely stop, theoretically. You cannot get any colder than that because there's no way to add more coldness. You can only remove heat, and when all the heat's gone, that's as far as you can go. Same basic point applies to many descriptive words. Terms such as short or thin are all references to the relative lack of something else. There's no such thing as shortness, and one cannot add to shortness. There are only varying measurements of length. Printer paper is not thin because it has more thinness added to it than cardboard. We use the term thin so we don't have to say less thick. An example from mathematics is the constant I, or the square root of -1. In reality, negative numbers can't have a square root, but there are places in advanced equation where it's a handy shortcut. The term I has meaning, at least in theory, even though we know it's not a literal description of some tangible thing. Another mathematical example is the number 0. The term 0 literally refers to that which does not exist. It's a reference to nothing, to the absence of something. This is why adding or subtracting 0 results in no change. Multiplying 0 is still nothing, and dividing by 0 is a logical contradiction. Is 0 real? In the sense that it's a term we can understand that has use. Yes, 0 is real, but of course 0 doesn't exist in any tangible sense. It's literally defined as the absence of something, everything else. Putting all these thoughts together, then, the same can be said of evil. The term has meaning and use, but we don't have to assume it's some actual tangible created thing. Evil is a relative term used to mean anything that deviates from the will or moral perfection of God. Evil is a lack of goodness. All by itself, this reasoning goes a long way toward forming a proper theodicy. If evil is not some thing God created or some force outside of God that he can't control, then the meaning of these questions becomes very different. Any premise that requires God to have created, formed, or generated evil is immediately invalidated. All that is required, then, is for God to have allowed it. Next, let's look at our will versus God's will. The debate of how we define evil doesn't stop there, however. For many critics, the objection to God being all good inherently means never allowing any evil. The first problem with this view of God's goodness is logical. The second is personal. Logically, if God is perfect, then anything different from him in any way is no longer perfect. You can't change absolute, complete perfection and still be absolutely, completely perfect. This means that anything God creates is by definition different from him and must be less than perfect. Considering evil as a deviation from God's goodness, this leads to two possibilities in order for God to be completely and totally avoid evil of any kind. First, God could simply not create anything at all. Second, God could create but allow nothing in his creation the capacity for moral free will. In other words, no deviation leading to evil. But this makes a mockery of every other emotion, ideal, and benefit that critics of God want to uphold. In short, a universe logically incapable of evil is also one logically incapable of love, nobility, sacrifice, or success. A being unable to partake in evil is also incapable of exhibiting mercy, compassion, or love. It's not hard to see. If God had created things with this limitation, our creation would seem like a waste of time. God desires love and glory, and our approval of that desire is irrelevant to its truth. But there can be no love given by robotic, choiceless creations. So, for God to preclude even the possibility of evil, he must either not create or create something utterly pointless. Logically, it stands to reason that God allows the potential for evil because such freedom is intrinsically the same that allows the potential for nobility and virtue. Without that potential, no love or other good things can actually occur. This leads to the personal problem with demanding that God disallow evil. Once a person accepts the idea that evil has to be possible in order for us to have a meaningful free will, the next step is often to criticize God for allowing too much evil or the wrong kinds of evil. Here again, definitions and personal preferences are key. Critics of God often make an assumption at this stage. They make statements such as a good God might allow some evil, but he would never allow X. Once again, the logic leading to this point shows that God does not have to create evil for it to exist. The question also assumes irrationally, that there cannot be things worse than X. Logically, it's possible there could be evils even worse than X that God has prevented, and because he has prevented them, we are unaware they are even possible. To continue to criticize God on account of there being too much evil is to waffle between logic and emotion. We may not like the idea that God allows certain kinds of evil. Logically, there's nothing invalid about a person choosing to say, I reject obedience to God because I don't agree with his morality. But theodicy is not a question of making God agree with our whims. What we cannot say logically is that if God does not act according to our moral preferences, then he cannot exist in moral perfection. This makes the critic the ultimate standard of morality. To put that another way, claiming God cannot exist or cannot be perfectly moral unless he agrees with my moral preferences is to say this: I am morally perfect. So if God and I differ on some moral issue, the only possible reason is that God is flawed and I am not. Once again, a person is not logically prevented from taking this approach, but just because it's a possible viewpoint does not make it a reasonable one. Does this mean there could never be a circumstance where God's supposed morality conflicts with what we see in our experience? Not at all. The problem, for the critic, is that many of these rules he claims God fails to live up to are simply fictional. God never promises to make everyone's life easier or better, nor does he promise to alter cause and effect simply at our whims. There's an external context and spiritual condition to what God tells us about suffering and evil in this world. This is a key part of any reasonable theodicy. So why allow evil? Logic says that God does not have to create evil in order for there to be evil. Logic says that God does not have to conform to our moral preferences in order to be perfectly good. So then how can a person rationalize the existence of evil in a way that's relevant to our own experience? The first point that must be realized is that God is consistent in his allowance of our free will and the natural function of his creation. As it turns out, it's the fact that God is consistent in his moral behaviors that greatly aggravates the skeptic. This is because God's consistency runs counter to our human preferences. We'd rather God bend or break the rules to suit our own selfish preferences. For example, God's consistent in allowing human beings a broad use of free will. This includes allowing people the freedom to reject his will and spurn his commands. This can result in consequences for those who choose to disobey. At the same time, much of the suffering of man on earth is due to the decisions of other people. There again, God's being consistent in allowing humanity the freedom to act. This is really nothing more than a rephrasing of the earlier argument about allowing the potential for evil, because without it, there's no potential for good. The same natural laws that allow us to build skyscrapers and develop medicines can be abused to make bombs and illicit drugs. They're the same laws that produce earthquakes and hurricanes. Too often, we make choices knowing the risks involved or with a deliberate intent to misuse creation, and then blame God when those potential problems materialize. The second point to make is that God is not motionless, silent, and inactive in the face of evil. Here again is a point where the critic becomes inconsistent. The same voices who attempt to say God's not doing enough to stop evil are almost always the same ones who object when God does anything to stop evil. The incidents most often pointed to by critics of the Bible as evidence for God's supposed immorality, such as the destruction of Sodom or the Canaanites, or the supposed oppression of women, name any Old Testament slavery, name anything you want to list, were times when God explicitly stated his actions were a promise to malevolence. In those that I listed going off script, I can't really use slavery in that example because God didn't specifically intervene in all instances of slavery took place in the Bible. For more on Christianity overcoming slavery, look at other videos on my channel. There's about a 4 or 5 part series on slavery on this channel. But things like Sodom and Gomorrah, things like the flood, there are other things that God did to overcome human sin. Things like the Canaanites, another example of where God overcame human sin. The way when God intervened in those situations, those interventions were his means of stopping and preventing more evil. The same critic who cries God does nothing about evil is too often the same person willing to call God immoral for his actions, like I just said, in the flood, or against the Amalekites, or Jericho. God's already taken steps to neutralize and counter evil. Saying he does nothing is simply untrue. Complaining he does too much to stop evil is all well and good, but that makes theodicy irrelevant and the problem of evil moot. The third point is that we have a limited perspective. This is not a very persuasive argument, especially for someone hostile to the idea of God, but logically it has to be said that the God under examination is posited to be omniscient, omnipotent, eternal, and omnipresent. We, of course, are not. We often hear employers, military personnel, parents, doctors, and others reminding us that there are things happening behind the scenes that we simply cannot understand. Our inability to understand certain decisions is not hard evidence that those decisions are wrong. It means nothing more than we have incomplete understanding. Finally, one has to take all criticisms of evil in the entire context of Christian teaching. If this life were all there is, then the problem of evil would be a much bigger problem. However, according to the Bible, this is not the only life we're going to live. A person can reject that belief, but he cannot criticize the God of the Bible and his morality as if the afterlife were not an intrinsic part of Christian moral understanding. Christians believe that all wrongs, every single one, will be reckoned with someday. They believe that God is acting to restrain all evil now, just as he has in the past. The Bible makes it clear that the struggles we experience now are not the purpose for which we exist, nor do they define our value. Instead, there is a point to the suffering and a plan that involves making all wrongs right. Back to the beginning. Looking at these ideas, then, we can see that Epicurus' version of the problem of evil suffers from a fatal flaw. This can be summed up in one simple statement. The God Epicurus criticizes is not the God of the Bible. In other words, Epicurus' criticism only works against the deities of Greek polytheism and in the context of a polytheistic view of reality. The Christian can respond to Epicurus as follows. Is God willing to prevent evil but unable to? Then he's not omnipotent. The Christian can respond to Epicurus by saying God is willing to limit evil and has acted to do just that. So he is omnipotent. When Epicurus says, is God able to prevent evil but not willing to prevent evil? Then he is malevolent. When Epicurus says that, the Christian can respond that God is able but not willing to abolish our free will, so he is still omnibenevolent. When Epicurus says, is God both able and willing to prevent evil? Then where does evil come from? When Epicurus says that, the Christian can say God has acted to defeat evil. Evil comes when we simply fall short of God's will. When Epicurus says, is God neither able nor willing to prevent evil, then why do we call him God? The Christian can say in response that God is not willing to prevent our free will. Your disapproval does not make him any less God. And to the more pop culture friendly Lex Luthor, Christianity can respond as follows. If God is all powerful, he cannot be all good, and if he's all good, then he cannot be all powerful. That's the Lex Luthor quote. The Christian can respond that God can be all powerful and choose not to act according to your preferences. When you say all good, what you really mean is doing things my way, and when you say all powerful, what you really mean is capable of making us simultaneously free and robotic, which is gibberish. An all-powerful, all-good God can allow evil in order to obtain the greater eternal good. Human beings will always struggle with the problem of evil. Theodicy is not an attempt to make God appear as palatable as possible. In fact, the opposite is true. A truly rational theodicy has to begin with the admission that our dislike of something does not make it false. The question is not whether God is compatible with your personal preferences. The problem of evil is simply the debate over whether or not God is logically possible. Theodicy, taking all logic and evidence together, clearly says God is logically possible, whether we like him or not. So that's the end of the second video that I have to respond to Alex's video on the problem of evil. Go back and check the first one from Dallas Theological Seminary. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day. I see the evidence.